The shadow of a crow. Mona's world had always been painted in two tones, the vibrant warmth of her home life and the cold, gray hostility she faced outside of it. Her parents had moved to this picturesque village in hopes of a better life, believing its quiet streets and fresh air would nurture their only daughter. Yet, beneath its serene exterior, the village harbored biases that left Mona feeling like a stranger in her own home. At just 14 years old, Mona's days were filled with more challenges than most her age should bear. Her mornings began early, her mother waking her with a soft hum of an old folk song as the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the small kitchen. Her father, when not at sea, would pat her head and offer words of encouragement before she left for school. These brief moments of love and normalcy were the armor she donned each day to face the outside world. The bullying began subtly at first, sideways glances, hushed whispers, and the occasional muffled giggle. Mona, ever observant and sharp, ignored them, burying herself in her books. She had dreams bigger than the rolling hills and cobblestone streets of her village. Her imagination carried her to faraway places where people of all colors and backgrounds were celebrated for their differences. But as she grew older, the taunts became crueler, more direct. "Do you think her skin's that color because she fell in the mud?" One boy sneered during recess, earning a roar of laughter from his group. "She probably eats dirt for breakfast," another chimed in, shoving Mona as she passed. Mona clenched her fists but kept walking, her eyes fixed on the ground. She had learned the hard way that standing up for herself only made things worse. The teachers, though aware of the harassment, rarely intervened. Some dismissed it as harmless teasing. Others seemed to share the same prejudices as the children. One particularly harsh winter morning, Mona arrived at school to find her locker defaced. Scrawled in red paint were the words, "Go back where you came from." Her throat tightened as she fought back tears. She didn't know where back was supposed to be. This village was the only home she had ever known. That evening, Mona returned home quiet and withdrawn. Her mother noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong, love?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on Mona's shoulder. "Nothing," Mona mumbled, staring at her plate. She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother about the bullying. How could she? Her parents had sacrificed so much to give her a better life. Admitting that she was miserable felt like a betrayal. But the cracks in her resolve deepened. One day, during lunch, the bullying took a cruel turn. A group of older girls cornered Mona near the school's storage shed. They jeered and mocked her, throwing insults that cut deeper than any physical blow. Then one of them did the unthinkable. She grabbed Mona's lunch and dumped it on the ground, stomping on it with her boot. "Oops," the girl said with a smirk. "Guess you'll have to go hungry today." Mona felt something inside her break. For the first time, she shouted back, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "Why do you hate me so much? What did I ever do to you?" The girls laughed. "You exist," one of them replied before walking away. That night, Mona cried herself to sleep. The day everything changed began like any other. It was a crisp spring morning, and the sun had just begun to rise over the village. Mona, her heart heavy, made her way to school, dreading what the day might bring. During morning assembly, the headmaster announced a special project. Each class was to plant a tree in the schoolyard as part of an environmental awareness campaign. Mona's classmates groaned, but she perked up. She loved nature and saw the project as an opportunity to escape the confines of the classroom, if only for a while. The following week, her class gathered outside, each student armed with shovels and saplings. Mona was assigned to work with a boy named Henry, one of the few classmates who didn't actively bully her, but rarely spoke up in her defense either. As they worked side by side, digging a hole for their tree, Henry glanced at Mona and hesitated before speaking. I don't think it's right. The way they treat you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mona froze, her shovel poised midair. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged her pain. "Then why don't you say something?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Henry looked away, ashamed. I don't know. I guess I'm scared. Mona sighed. She wanted to be angry with him, but she understood. Fear was a powerful force. As they continued to dig, a shadow passed overhead. Mona looked up to see a large black crow circling the schoolyard. Its glossy feathers shimmered in the sunlight, and its sharp eyes seemed to scan the crowd. Crows are bad luck, one of the girls sneered, pointing at the bird. Maybe it's here for you, Mona. The other students laughed, but Mona ignored them. There was something about the crow that fascinated her. It was strong, proud, and unbothered by the chaos around it. Over the next few days, the crow became a fixture in Mona's life. It appeared every morning, perched on the school fence or a nearby tree, watching her with an almost human-like intensity. Some of the students began calling it Mona's crow, using it as another excuse to mock her. But Mona didn't mind. In some strange way, the crow's presence felt comforting, as if it were silently rooting for her. She started leaving scraps of bread on the windowsill at home, hoping the crow would visit her there. And it did. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mona sat on her porch, watching the crow peck at the bread she had left out. I wish I were like you, she whispered. Strong, free, and unafraid. The crow tilted its head, as if it understood her words. The weeks passed, and the crow remained a constant in Mona's life. But just as she began to find solace in its presence, tragedy struck. One afternoon, as Mona walked home from school, a group of boys ambushed her. They had been waiting for her in the alley near the bakery, their faces twisted with malice. Think you're better than us, don't you? One of them sneered. Before Mona could respond, they shoved her to the ground. Her books scattered across the cobblestones, and her knees scraped against the rough surface. Maybe this will teach you to stay in your place, another boy said, raising his foot to stomp on her belongings. Suddenly, a loud caw pierced the air. The crow swooped down from a nearby rooftop, its wings outstretched and talons gleaming. It dove at the boys, pecking and clawing with fierce determination. The boys screamed and scattered, leaving Mona alone in the alley. The crow landed beside her, its dark eyes filled with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. For the first time in months, Mona smiled. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. The omen of feathers. The encounter in the alley marked a turning point in Mona's life. Though she didn't yet realize it, the crow had become more than a silent observer. It was now her protector, a creature that had intervened when no one else would. As she walked home that evening, clutching her scraped knees and bruised pride, she felt an unusual sense of comfort. She had always been alone in her struggles, but for the first time, she felt like she had an ally, even if it was just a bird. The crow followed her home that night, its sharp caws echoing in the twilight. Her mother, hearing the sound, came to the door with a puzzled expression. A crow, following you? She asked, peering at the bird perched on the gate. That's unusual. Crows are smart, though. They remember faces. Maybe it likes you. Mona nodded but said nothing. Deep down, she felt there was more to it than that. The crow didn't just like her. It felt intentional, almost as if it had chosen her for a reason. The following weeks brought a strange shift in Mona's world. The crow was always nearby, waiting on the school gate in the morning, perching on a tree during recess, and even following her home in the afternoons. At first, it unnerved her classmates, who whispered superstitions about crows being harbingers of death or bad luck. But as time passed, their fear turned to mockery. Look, it's Mona and her pet crow. One girl sneered during lunch, pointing at the bird as it sat on a nearby branch. Maybe it's the only friend she can get. The other students laughed, but Mona no longer cared. The crow's presence gave her a quiet confidence she hadn't felt before. It was as if the bird's unyielding gaze reminded her of her own strength, a strength she was only beginning to uncover. One crisp morning, Mona woke to find the crow perched on her bedroom windowsill. It had never come so close before, and for a moment, she simply stared at it, unsure of what to do. The bird tilted its head, its dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Good morning," she whispered, feeling slightly foolish for speaking to a bird. To her surprise, the crow let out a soft caw, almost as if responding. She opened the window, and the bird hopped inside, its glossy feathers glinting in the sunlight. It dropped something at her feet, a small, shiny object that glimmered like a treasure. Picking it up, she realized it was a fragment of an old locket, tarnished but still beautiful. "Where did you get this?" she asked, holding the locket up to the light. The crow only cawed again before flying back out the window. Mona tucked the locket fragment into her pocket, her mind racing with questions. Why had the crow brought it to her? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more to it? Later that day, as Mona walked to school, she couldn't stop thinking about the locket. It felt heavy in her pocket, almost as if it were pulsating with a faint energy. When she reached the school gate, the crow was already there, waiting for her. "You're really something, aren't you?" she said, smiling at the bird. It let out a loud caw, drawing the attention of a few nearby students. "Ooh, it's that stupid crow again," one boy muttered, rolling his eyes. But Mona ignored him. She had grown tired of letting their words affect her. That afternoon, during a history lesson, Mona found herself distracted. She kept tracing the outline of the locket fragment in her pocket, her thoughts drifting far from the classroom. When the final bell rang, she was eager to leave, but her teacher stopped her at the door. "Mona." "A word," the teacher said, her tone firm. Mona froze. She had never been called aside before, and her heart sank as she wondered what she had done wrong. "I've noticed your grades slipping," the teacher said, folding her arms. "You're a bright girl, Mona, but you've been distracted lately. Is everything all right?" Mona hesitated. She wanted to tell her teacher about the bullying, about the crow, about everything, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she simply nodded. "I'm fine," she said quietly. The teacher sighed. "If you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open." Mona nodded again and left, feeling a pang of guilt. She appreciated the teacher's concern, but she couldn't shake the feeling that no one would truly understand what she was going through. As she walked home, the crow swooped down from a tree and landed on her shoulder. Mona flinched at first, but quickly relaxed. The bird's presence, though unusual, was comforting. "You won't leave me, will you?" she murmured, reaching up to gently stroke its feathers. The crow let out a soft caw, almost as if to reassure her. That evening, as she sat on her bed examining the locket fragment, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint inscription etched into the metal. Squinting, she traced the letters with her finger. "For E.M., with love." "E.M.," she whispered aloud. The initials meant nothing to her, but they ignited a curiosity she couldn't ignore. The next day, Mona decided to visit the village library. It was a small, dusty building that rarely saw visitors, but Mona loved it. The librarian, Mrs. Hawthorne, was a kind old woman who always greeted her with a warm smile. "Back again, Mona," Mrs. Hawthorne said as Mona entered. "What are you looking for today?" I'm not sure," Mona admitted, pulling out the locket fragment. "I found this, and I was wondering if there's a way to trace where it came from." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened as she examined the locket. "My, this is old," she murmured. "It looks like something from the late 1800s. Where did you find it?" Mona hesitated. "A friend gave it to me," she said, not wanting to explain the crow. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "If you're interested, you might check the village records. We have an archive upstairs with old newspapers and family histories. You might find something there." Excitement bubbled in Mona's chest. "Thank you," she said, hurrying upstairs. The archive was a treasure trove of yellowed papers and leather-bound books. Mona spent hours poring over the records, searching for any mention of the initials EM or a locket. Just as she was about to give up, she stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Tragedy in the Village. Young girl goes missing. Mysterious circumstances." Mona's heart raced as she read the article. It described the disappearance of a girl named Eleanor Matthews in 1892. Eleanor, the daughter of a wealthy family, had vanished without a trace. Her parents had searched desperately for her, but the only clue they found was a broken locket near the edge of the forest. Mona's hands trembled as she read the final line of the article. Some villagers claimed to see a black crow circling the area in the days leading up to her disappearance, an omen they believed to be tied to her fate. She stared at the clipping, her mind spinning. The locket, the crow, it couldn't be a coincidence. But what did it mean? And why had the crow brought the locket to her? As she left the library that evening, the crow was waiting for her on a lamppost, its dark eyes gleaming in the fading light. Mona looked up at it, a sense of determination rising within her. "I don't know what you're trying to tell me," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm going to find out." The crow let out a piercing caw, as if in approval, before taking flight. The whispering forest. Mona couldn't sleep that night. The weight of the locket fragment and the mystery surrounding it pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. The article about Eleanor Matthews played over and over in her mind. Who was this girl, and what had happened to her? And why had the crow brought the locket to Mona over a century later? The next morning, Mona woke early, her resolve hardening. She had to find the answers, no matter where they led. The first step, she decided, was to visit the forest mentioned in the article. It was an old, sprawling woodland on the outskirts of the village, a place that few dared to enter. Stories of strange happenings and eerie sightings had surrounded it for generations, earning it the nickname the Whispering Forest. Mona packed a small bag with a flashlight, a notebook, and a sandwich her mother had made for her. She didn't tell her parents where she was going. They would only worry. Instead, she left a note saying she was heading to the library again. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air, the crow was waiting for her on the gatepost, as if it knew her plans. "You're coming too, I see," Mona said with a nervous smile. The crow cawed softly in response before taking flight, circling above her as she walked toward the forest. The forest loomed ahead like a dark, shadowy giant. Its trees, tall and ancient, stood tightly packed together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. As she stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and moss. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under her feet and the occasional rustle of branches. The crow flew ahead, pausing on low-hanging branches as if guiding her deeper into the woods. Mona followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but the eerie stillness of the forest sent shivers down her spine. After what felt like hours of walking, she came to a small clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone monument, covered in moss and ivy. Mona approached it cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. The monument was weathered and cracked, but she could still make out faint carvings on its surface. It was a name, Eleanor Matthews. Mona's pulse quickened. This was it, proof that Eleanor had been here. But why was there a monument in the middle of the forest? Was it a memorial? A grave? She knelt to examine it more closely, running her fingers over the worn stone. As she did, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint sound of whispering. Mona froze, her heart pounding. The whispers were soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. "Help me," the voice seemed to say, carried on the wind. Mona spun around, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The forest was silent once more, save for the distant cawing of the crow. Determined not to let fear deter her, Mona pulled out her notebook and began sketching the monument, taking care to replicate the carvings. She noted the surrounding area as well. The pattern of the trees, the direction of the path she had taken, and any other details that seemed important. As she worked, the crow perched on the monument, watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being tested. Once she had finished, she stood and looked around the clearing. Something glinted in the grass near the base of the monument, catching her eye. Kneeling, she brushed aside the leaves and dirt to reveal another fragment of the locket. Her breath caught in her throat. It was larger than the piece she already had, and this one bore a new inscription: forever. Mona placed the fragment in her pocket alongside the first, her mind racing. The two pieces fit together perfectly, forming half of the original locket. She now had half of the puzzle, but the other half, and the truth, was still out there. The walk back through the forest was uneventful, though the whispers seemed to follow her, faint and elusive. By the time she emerged into the sunlight, she was both relieved and determined. She couldn't explain the whispers or the crow's guidance, but she knew she was on the right track. As she neared the village, she decided to stop by the library again. Mrs. Hawthorne greeted her warmly, as always, but her expression turned serious when Mona mentioned the monument in the forest. "Ah, the Matthews Memorial," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice tinged with sadness. "The villagers built it after Eleanor disappeared. They searched the forest for weeks, but all they found was her locket. Her parents insisted she had been taken by something unnatural, perhaps even cursed, but no one ever found out the truth." "Do you believe the stories?" Mona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated. "I don't know, dear. The forest is a strange place, full of mysteries. But I do know this. Eleanor was a bright and kind girl, much like you. She didn't deserve what happened to her." Mona nodded, her resolve hardening. She couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's story wasn't over, and that the crow had chosen her for a reason. That night, as Mona sat in her room piecing together the fragments of the locket, the crow landed on her windowsill once again. This time, it carried something unusual in its beak, a small tattered piece of paper. Mona gently took the paper and unfolded it, her eyes widening as she saw what was written inside. It was a map. The ink was faded and the paper fragile, but the markings were clear. It depicted the forest, with a large X near the center. Beneath the map was a single word, written in elegant script: "Find." Mona stared at the map, her heart pounding. She didn't know how the crow had come by it, or why it had brought it to her, but one thing was clear: she had to follow it. "You're leading me somewhere, aren't you?" she said, looking at the bird. It cawed softly in response, its dark eyes gleaming with a knowledge that both comforted and unnerved her. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The secrets beneath the soil. The map haunted Mona throughout the night, its delicate lines and cryptic markings burning into her mind. The X at the center of the forest seemed to call to her, promising answers, or perhaps more mysteries. She spent hours studying the map, trying to decipher its meaning. Why had the crow brought it to her? And who had written the single word at the bottom? Find. By dawn, Mona's determination had crystallized. She tucked the map into her notebook and packed a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a thick scarf for the forest's damp chill. The crow was already waiting on the windowsill, as if it knew her plans. "You're not going to leave me alone, are you?" Mona murmured, pulling on her coat. The crow cawed softly, its head tilted in what she could only describe as encouragement. The forest felt different this time. The air was heavier, the whispers louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than before. Mona clutched the map tightly, using it to guide her deeper into the woods. The crow flew ahead, pausing every so often to ensure she was following. The path was treacherous, overgrown with brambles and tangled roots. Mona stumbled several times, her hands and knees scraping against the rough earth. But she pressed on, driven by a force she couldn't fully explain. After what felt like hours, she reached the spot marked by the X on the map. It was a small, sunlit clearing surrounded by towering trees. In the center stood a massive ancient oak, its gnarled roots twisting above the ground like the fingers of a sleeping giant. The crow perched on one of its branches, watching her silently. Mona approached the tree cautiously, her heart pounding. At the base of the oak, she noticed something unusual, a patch of disturbed earth, as if someone, or something, had recently dug there. She dropped to her knees and began digging with her hands, the soil cold and damp beneath her fingers. The crow cawed softly, almost as if urging her on. After several minutes, her hands hit something hard. She brushed away the dirt to reveal a small, rusted tin box. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside was a collection of objects that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary. A faded photograph of a young girl with bright eyes and a shy smile, a delicate ribbon tied into a bow, and the other half of the locket. Mona's breath caught in her throat. The girl in the photograph had to be Eleanor. She looked so alive, so full of promise. But why had these items been buried here, and who had buried them? She picked up the locket fragment and placed it next to the pieces she already had. They fit together perfectly, forming a heart-shaped pendant. On the back was a complete inscription: "For Eleanor Matthews, forever loved." As Mona stared at the locket, the whispers around her grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the tree itself, weaving through its branches like an unseen wind. "Help me," the voice murmured again, clearer than before. Mona's heart raced. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The whispers didn't respond directly, but the crow let out a sharp caw, drawing her attention back to the box. Beneath the photograph and ribbon was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Mona unfolded it carefully, her eyes widening as she read the faded handwriting. "To whomever finds this, Eleanor did not vanish by chance. She was taken, stolen by the darkness that dwells in this forest. I have tried to bring her back, but the forest will not let her go. If you are reading this, it means you have been chosen. Please, do what I could not. Save her. Margaret Matthews." Mona's hands shook as she read the note. Margaret Matthews, Eleanor's mother, had known about the forest's dark secrets. But what did she mean by the darkness? And why had the crow brought Mona here? Before she could think further, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. The trees seemed to shift, their branches creaking and groaning. The air grew colder, and the sunlight in the clearing dimmed, as if something unseen was blotting it out. The crow let out a loud, piercing caw and flew to a lower branch, its sharp gaze fixed on the ground beside Mona. She turned to see another patch of disturbed earth, this one smaller and less obvious than the first. Summoning her courage, Mona began digging again. This time, she uncovered a small, hollowed-out space beneath the tree's roots. Inside was a shimmering orb of light, faint and ethereal, pulsating like a heartbeat. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The orb felt warm in her hands, its glow spreading through her fingers like liquid sunlight. She didn't know what it was, but she felt its importance deep in her soul. The crow cawed again, this time more urgently, as if warning her. Suddenly, the forest came alive. The shadows around her thickened, twisting and writhing like living creatures. A low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing, and the ground beneath her began to tremble. Mona scrambled to her feet, clutching the orb tightly. The crow swooped down, circling her protectively as the shadows closed in. She could feel their malice, their hunger, as if they wanted to consume her. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice shaking. But the shadows only grew darker, more oppressive. In that moment, the orb in her hands began to glow brighter, its warmth spreading through her entire body. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as if burned. Mona realized the orb was protecting her, but she didn't know for how long. The crow let out a series of sharp caws, diving at the shadows to keep them at bay. Mona took a deep breath, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't stay there. Clutching the orb, she turned and ran, following the crow as it led her back through the forest. The journey back to the village was a blur of fear and adrenaline. The shadows pursued her, their growls echoing through the trees, but the orb's light kept them at a distance. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, the shadows had receded, retreating into the darkness where they belonged. Mona collapsed onto the grass, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The crow landed beside her, its dark eyes filled with a strange mix of relief and urgency. She looked down at the orb in her hands, its glow now faint but steady. Somehow, she knew this was the key to everything: the locket, Eleanor, and the forest's dark secrets. "I'll save you, Eleanor," Mona whispered, her voice filled with determination. "I don't know how, but I will." The crow cawed softly, as if in agreement, into the heart of the shadows. Mona sat on the edge of the forest, clutching the faintly glowing orb as the weight of her journey pressed down on her. She knew she couldn't turn back now. The orb had shown her its power, protecting her from the forest's darkness, but it was also a reminder of the unfinished task before her. Somewhere within the twisted shadows of the woods, Eleanor Matthews was waiting to be found, or freed. The crow landed beside her, its sharp gaze unwavering. Mona met its eyes, feeling a strange sense of understanding pass between them. "You know what I need to do, don't you?" she asked softly. The crow cawed at once, a firm sound that seemed to say, "Yes." With a deep breath, Mona stood. The whispers had quieted, the shadows no longer pursued her, but she knew they were still there, watching and waiting. She turned back toward the forest, her heart pounding. The orb's faint light pulsed rhythmically, as if urging her forward. The forest felt more oppressive than ever as she re-entered its depths. The air was colder, the trees seemed taller, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands trying to block out the sky. The path ahead was unfamiliar, and Mona quickly realized the forest was shifting, its layout changing with each step she took. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, determined to keep her lost. The crow flew ahead, pausing occasionally to wait for her. Its presence was the only constant in the ever-changing maze of trees. Mona clutched the orb tightly, its light dim but steady. She could feel its warmth spreading through her fingers, giving her the courage to press on. After what felt like hours, she came to a small brook, its clear water glinting faintly in the dim light. The crow landed on a nearby rock and let out a sharp caw, drawing her attention to the water. Peering into the brook, Mona gasped. Reflected in the water was not her own face, but that of a young girl with bright eyes and a soft, hesitant smile. Eleanor Matthews. The image flickered like a ghostly projection, but it was unmistakable. "Eleanor," Mona whispered, leaning closer. The water rippled, and the image faded, but a soft voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed through the air. "Find me, beneath the roots." Mona's pulse quickened. "Beneath the roots," she repeated, glancing at the crow. "Do you know where she means?" The crow cawed and took flight, circling above her before heading deeper into the forest. Mona scrambled to her feet, following as quickly as she could. The journey grew more treacherous the farther she went. The ground became uneven, the air thick with a strange, heavy energy. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices blending into a haunting symphony that seemed to come from all directions. "Turn back. You don't belong here. Leave her to us." Mona ignored them, focusing on the crow as it led her to a massive tree unlike any she had seen before. Its trunk was as wide as a house, its roots sprawling across the ground like a web of veins. The tree's bark was blackened, as if scorched by fire, and its branches were bare despite the surrounding forest's lush greenery. The crow landed on one of the roots, cawing loudly. Mona approached cautiously, her hands trembling. The orb in her hand began to glow brighter, its warmth intensifying as she neared the tree. At the base of the tree was a hollow, dark, and foreboding. The orb's light illuminated the entrance, revealing a narrow tunnel that led into the earth. Mona hesitated, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Don't go. It's not your place. She's ours." Mona took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'm not afraid of you," she said aloud, her voice trembling but firm. Clutching the orb, she stepped into the hollow. The tunnel was narrow and dark, the air thick and damp. Mona had to crouch as she moved forward, the orb lighting her way. The whispers followed her, their tone shifting from warnings to pleas. "Save her. Free her. Bring her back." The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls shimmering faintly with an otherworldly light. In the center of the cavern was a pedestal, and on it rested the locket, now whole and glowing with a faint ethereal light. Surrounding the pedestal were shadows, their forms shifting and writhing like living smoke. As Mona stepped closer, the shadows turned toward her. They hissed and swirled, their voices blending into a cacophony of anger and sorrow. "She's ours. You can't take her. She belongs to us." Mona held up the orb, its light flaring brightly. The shadows recoiled, their hissing growing louder. "I'm here to save her," Mona said, her voice steady. "You can't keep her." The shadows surged forward, but the orb's light held them at bay. Mona stepped closer to the pedestal, her heart pounding. The locket seemed to pulse in time with the orb, as if they were connected. As she reached out to take the locket, the shadows lashed out, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. Mona cried out, the orb's light flickering under the force of their attack. But the crow swooped down, its sharp cries cutting through the air. It dove at the shadows, driving them back with its talons and wings. Summoning all her courage, Mona grabbed the locket. The moment her fingers touched it, a blinding light filled the cavern, forcing the shadows to retreat. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the locket itself. The light faded, and the cavern was silent. Mona opened her eyes to see the locket glowing softly in her hand. The shadows were gone, and the orb's light had merged with the locket, creating a warm golden glow. From the corner of the cavern, a faint figure emerged. It was Eleanor, her form translucent but whole. She looked at Mona with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You freed me." Mona felt tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done it without the crow," she said, glancing at the bird. It cawed softly, landing on her shoulder. Eleanor smiled. "The crow is more than it seems. It's a guardian sent to guide those who are willing to listen." As Eleanor's form began to fade, she reached out and touched Mona's hand. "Take the locket," she said. "It will protect you, just as it protected me. And never forget, you have the strength to face any darkness." With those words, Eleanor vanished, leaving Mona alone in the cavern. The locket in her hand felt warm, its glow a comforting reminder of what she had accomplished. Mona turned and made her way back through the tunnel, the crow at her side. When she emerged into the forest, the air felt lighter, the oppressive energy gone. The trees seemed brighter, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. As she stepped into the sunlight, Mona knew her life would never be the same. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And though Eleanor was gone, her story would live on, through the locket, through the forest, and through Mona herself. The legacy of light. The forest, once foreboding and oppressive, now felt different as Mona emerged into the sunlight. The air was crisp, the trees swayed gently in the wind, and the oppressive whispers were gone. She clutched the glowing locket tightly in her hand, feeling its warmth radiate through her fingers. It was more than just an object now. It was a symbol of what she had endured, a reminder of Eleanor's story, and a beacon of hope. The crow landed on her shoulder, its dark feathers gleaming in the light. It cawed softly, as if congratulating her, before nuzzling her cheek with its beak. For the first time in weeks, Mona smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. She had done it. She had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and freed Eleanor. But as she looked back at the forest, she knew her journey wasn't over. The darkness she had faced wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a reflection of the cruelty and prejudice she encountered in her daily life. If she had learned anything from Eleanor's story, it was that standing against darkness, no matter its form, required courage, resilience, and the willingness to act. The return home. When Mona returned to her village, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the cobblestone streets. She hesitated at the edge of the village, unsure of how to explain where she had been. Her clothes were torn and muddy, her hands scratched and bruised, and she carried a locket that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. But there was no hiding the change in her. She felt stronger, more certain of herself, and more determined than ever to make a difference. As she walked through the village, the usual whispers and sidelong glances followed her. The same children who had bullied her giggled and pointed, and the adults turned away, pretending not to see her. But this time, Mona didn't lower her head. She walked tall, her gaze steady, her heart unshaken. When she reached her house, her mother was waiting on the porch, her face etched with worry. "Mona, where have you been? I've been so worried," she exclaimed, rushing to embrace her. Mona hugged her mother tightly, tears welling in her eyes. "I had to do something, Mom. Something important." Her mother pulled back, studying her face. "You look different," she said softly. "What happened?" "It's a long story," Mona said, holding up the locket. "But I promise, I'll tell you everything." A new beginning. That evening, as Mona sat with her parents in their small, cozy kitchen, she recounted the entire tale: the bullying, the crow, the forest, and Eleanor's story. Her parents listened in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. When she finished, her father, who had always been a man of few words, spoke first. "Mona," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "what you've done, it's extraordinary. But you must be careful. Not everyone will understand." "I know," Mona replied, her gaze steady. "But I can't stay silent anymore. If I've learned anything from Eleanor, it's that we have to stand up against the darkness, no matter how hard it is." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "We're proud of you, love, and we'll stand with you." Mona nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her parents, the locket, and the crow, her ever-watchful guardian. The village awakens. In the days that followed, Mona began to speak out. She didn't shy away from the bullying at school, and when her classmates mocked her, she confronted them with a quiet strength that left them speechless. Slowly, her courage began to inspire others. Henry, the boy who had once been too afraid to defend her, started standing up to the bullies. Other students followed his lead, and the atmosphere at school began to shift. Mona also started sharing Eleanor's story with the villagers, weaving it into a narrative about courage, kindness, and the importance of standing together against prejudice. At first, people were skeptical. But as she spoke with passion and conviction, they began to listen. The locket, with its radiant glow, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. The crow, ever present, became a symbol of change. Villagers who had once viewed it as an omen of bad luck now saw it as a protector, a guardian of the forest, and of Mona herself. The Festival of Light. Months later, the village held its annual festival, a tradition meant to celebrate the harvest and the changing of the seasons. This year, Mona proposed a new addition, a ceremony to honor Eleanor Matthews and all those who had faced hardship and overcome it. The villagers, moved by Mona's story, agreed. On the night of the festival, they gathered in the town square, where a large lantern was lit in Eleanor's memory. Mona stood at the center, holding the locket, her voice ringing clear and strong as she spoke. "This locket," she said, holding it high, "is a symbol of Eleanor's light, a light that was nearly lost but was saved, because someone cared enough to act. It's a reminder that we all have the power to bring light to the darkness, to stand up against fear and hatred, and to create a world where everyone is seen and valued. The crowd erupted into applause, and one by one, the villagers lit their own lanterns, filling the square with a warm, golden glow. The crow circled above, its caws echoing through the night like a blessing. The legacy lives on. As the festival ended and the villagers returned to their homes, Mona stood at the edge of the square, the locket glowing softly in her hand. The crow landed beside her, its eyes reflecting the light of the lanterns. "You've been with me through all of this," Mona said, smiling at the bird. "Thank you." The crow cawed once, a sound that Mona could only interpret as "you're welcome," before taking flight. She watched it disappear into the night, knowing it would always be near. Mona's life was far from perfect, but she no longer felt powerless. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And as she walked home that night, the locket warm against her chest, she knew that Eleanor's light, and her own, would continue to shine, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The darkness had been faced. The light had prevailed. And Mona's story, like Eleanor's, was only just beginning. The Eternal Watcher. The days following the festival were unlike anything Mona had ever experienced. Her story, and Eleanor's, had sparked a wave of change in the village. The once quiet and secretive townsfolk now spoke openly about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes. It was as though the light of Eleanor's locket had illuminated not just the forest, but the hearts of everyone in the village. Still, not everyone was ready to embrace this newfound openness. Some of the older villagers whispered behind closed doors, skeptical of Mona's tale and uneasy about the crow's constant presence. To them, the forest was a place of danger, and the locket's glow was a mystery best left unexplored. But Mona, strengthened by her journey, refused to let doubt or fear deter her. She knew her story was only the beginning of something larger. A sudden disappearance. One crisp morning, Mona woke to find the crow missing. It was the first time in weeks that the bird hadn't been perched on her windowsill or waiting for her by the gate. At first, she thought it might simply be hunting or scouting the forest, but as the hours passed and the day turned to evening, her concern grew. The absence of the crow left an unsettling void. She had grown so accustomed to its watchful presence that she felt exposed without it. Clutching the locket, she decided to search for it. She followed the familiar path into the forest, its once threatening aura now tempered by the memories of her triumph. The whispers, though faint, had returned. They no longer held the malice they once did, but they carried a sorrowful tone, as though mourning something lost. "Have you seen the crow?" Mona asked aloud, her voice echoing through the trees. The whispers did not answer, but a sudden rustle in the bushes ahead drew her attention. Stepping cautiously, she found a trail of black feathers leading deeper into the woods. Her heart clenched as she followed the trail, the feathers growing more numerous the farther she went. At last, she reached a small clearing where the feathers stopped abruptly. There, in the center of the clearing, lay the crow, its wings splayed and its body eerily still. "No!" Mona cried, rushing to the bird's side. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. Its feathers were cold, its body lifeless. A sob caught in her throat as tears streamed down her face. The crow had been more than a guardian. It had been her companion, her protector, and her symbol of hope. Without it, she felt untethered, as though the connection to the magic of the forest had been severed. As her tears fell onto the bird's feathers, the locket around her neck began to glow brighter. Its warmth spread through her chest, filling her with a strange mix of grief and determination. She looked down at the crow, her heart aching, and whispered, "You've done so much for me. I won't let your story end like this." The revival ritual. The glow of the locket intensified, casting the clearing in a golden light. The whispers in the forest grew louder, their sorrowful tone shifting to one of urgency. Mona felt a pull, as if the locket were guiding her. She placed the locket on the crow's chest, her hands trembling as she closed her eyes and focused on its warmth. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You've saved me so many times. Let me save you." The locket's light flared, enveloping the crow in a radiant glow. Mona felt a surge of energy coursing through her, as though the very essence of the forest was flowing into her. The whispers became a harmonious hum, resonating deep within her soul. Suddenly, the crow's body twitched. Its wings fluttered weakly, and its dark eyes opened, glinting with a spark of life. Mona gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the crow slowly stood, shaking itself as if waking from a long slumber. "You're alive," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The crow cawed softly, its voice weaker than before, but filled with a quiet strength. It hopped onto her arm, nuzzling her cheek in a gesture of gratitude. The locket's glow dimmed, its light settling into a steady pulse. Mona felt a profound sense of relief, but also a deep understanding. The crow's life had been tied to the locket, and by saving it, she had strengthened their bond in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. The final warning. As Mona and the crow made their way back to the village, the whispers followed them, their tone shifting once more. This time, the voices were neither sorrowful nor urgent. They were warning her. Danger ahead. The darkness is not gone. It grows, stronger. Mona's heart sank. She had thought her journey was over, that freeing Eleanor and confronting the forest's shadows had brought an end to the darkness. But the whispers told a different story. Whatever malevolent force had taken Eleanor was still lurking, and it was growing. That night, as Mona lay in bed with the locket around her neck and the crow perched on the windowsill, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger and more dangerous than anything she had faced before. A village divided. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences began to plague the village. Crops withered overnight. Animals refused to enter the forest, and a thick, unnatural fog began creeping into the streets. The villagers grew restless, their fear mounting with each passing day. Some blamed the forest, saying the darkness had returned because Mona had meddled with forces beyond her understanding. Others looked to Mona for guidance, believing her connection to the locket and the crow made her the only one who could protect them. The village became divided, and Mona found herself at the center of it all. She knew she had to act, but she didn't know how. The locket, though powerful, held mysteries she had yet to uncover. And the crow, though loyal, could only guide her so far. The keeper of the locket. One night, as the fog thickened and the whispers grew louder, Mona sat by the fire, turning the locket over in her hands. She traced the inscription, "For Eleanor Matthews, forever loved," and wondered if it held a clue to the darkness's origins. The crow cawed softly, drawing her attention. It hopped onto her lap, its dark eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart race. Mona realized, in that moment, that the crow wasn't just her protector. It was a keeper of knowledge, a guardian of the locket's secrets. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. The crow cawed again, then flew to the window, its wings flaring as it stared out into the fog-covered streets. Mona followed its gaze, her resolve hardening. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. The darkness wasn't just a threat to the forest or the village. It was a threat to everything she loved. And she wouldn't stand by and let it consume them. Clutching the locket, she stepped into the fog, the crow by her side. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that light, no matter how small, could always pierce the darkness.